Today we're tackling the Swirl Feather, one of my favorite free motion quilting designs. It's great for dipping your toes into feathers for the first time. It's easy to do on a domestic sewing machine, and I think you guys are gonna love it. So let's get started. There are really only two elements to this design. There's the tight spiral center, and then there are the feathers that surround that tight spiral center. So the first thing we're gonna do is draw a circle. I'm going to draw it and come almost all the way around to where I begin. Then I'm going to start spiraling into the middle. Once I reach the middle, I'm going to just turn around and work my way back out. Once we've returned to where we began, it's time to start our feather petals. Now, if you've never drawn a feather before, it's just like drawing a heart. Kind of one of those perfect little Valentine's Day hearts. We're going to cut it in the middle and just draw half of it at a time. I'm going to start right here where we ended our spiral back out. And I'm going to draw a heart from the bottom point up to the middle. Once we are done with that, we are just going to continue making those half heart shapes all the way around. You're going to come up, you're going to kind of follow the previous feather petal and then return to that center spiral. Track along, half heart. Track along, half heart. Because of all that dense stitching in the middle, any little blobs or stitch overs that you have are going to blend into that center really nicely. So this is a very beginner friendly way to start with feathers if you are still getting used to that kind of half heart shape. Let's take a look at the anatomy of our feather swirl here. We have this center circle that we are surrounding with feathers, and that surrounding circle is much larger than the circle that we started with. So to fill that gap, each of these petal shapes needs to be a wedge. So the outer distance that it's covering at its widest point is significantly larger than the distance it's covering at the center. That could be a pretty significant difference. Here it looks like it's about maybe 4-to-1. And that exaggerated heart shape is what is going to allow us to bend those feather petals all the way around that center circle. So when you track around a feather petal, you want to make sure you make a pretty significant size from here to here before you start to return almost to where you began around that center circle. And that will help make your feather petals really spray around that center circle. So that's one design. Now I'm going to draw it again in a nice smooth motion, and then we're going to talk about joining those patterns together to make an all-over seamless design. So I'm currently right here on my stitching. I finished this petal and ended up back at kind of the spine of my little swirly center. From here, I want to make another swirl center, but I don't want to make it right here because then I will be stitching myself into this corner and it's going to be much harder to get out. So I want to work back around and maybe start over here. To do that, I am going to echo around these feather shapes. Now that I am out where I have a lot of space, I can make a new swirl. I've swirled back to here and it's time to start my petals. So I'm going to make sure that I smush those new feather petals up against what I've already quilted. I don't want to start my petal up here and leave all of this empty space. I want to take that first petal and really bend it around so that it smushes up and creates a nice consistent amount of quilting in that area. And then from there I can repeat that same motion. Let's pretend that this was the quilt surface. I'm kind of running up against the edge right here. If this is the edge of my quilt, I have a couple of options. I can assume that this gray area is like the batting, kind of the extra area I have around my white quilt top here, and just quilt off into that batting and just draw those shapes so that it looks like my petals aren't being squished up against the edge. or I can conform my design to fit the space. So that would look something like this, where my petals got smaller to fit in that area. There's no right or wrong here. It's just whatever look you like the best. I usually quilt off the edge because I like all of my feather petals to be generally the same size. If you've noticed, I kind of quilted myself into a center here. I ended right here. I can travel along this really densely quilted kind of spine and then poke back out between two feather petals to move around and get me to a nice open space that I can continue quilting. Once I'm out here, then I'm going to start the same process again and then start my feather petals all over again. If you want to go ahead and echo around every design to kind of establish that echo as part of the pattern, then you certainly can. Once you finish, you can echo around and even echo around multiple designs. I finished the echo here, I can bump around that one, and then let's say I wanted to make my next swirl here. Echoing around those designs allows you to move wherever you need to go. Now that we have the basic idea, let's see it stitched out. So here I am ready to free motion quilt the swirl feather design. I'm starting in the corner, but you could start anywhere along the side or even in the middle if you're more comfortable starting in the middle of your quilt. I did my swirl in and out and started with my feather petals, circling them around. Now this video is sped up significantly. I'll slow it down so that you can see real-time stitching. So here it is in real time. I am a very slow free motion quilter when I am working on my regular sewing machine. I am terrified of breaking a needle, even though it's happened to me before and nothing terrible has happened. I go really slowly so that I feel I have control and that I'm happy with the motions that I'm making. Free motion quilting is not a race, and you can go as slowly as you would like to feel good about what you're doing. Just coordinate the speed of your machine and the motion of your hands, and as long as your stitch length looks good to you, then you're going at the right speed for you. And now we're back to video speed. I'm just working my way around the center swirl, adding feather petals, and watching out for when I should bounce out and create my next swirl. I'm also keeping an eye out for dead spaces, like this little area I just filled with a feather petal. I want to be sure to fill places in before I get too far away from them so that I don't have weird spaces when I finish my quilt. These two swirls that I started with started in that clockwise direction and then spiraled back out counterclockwise. This one started counterclockwise and then spiraled back out clockwise. You do want to alternate those directions so that you end up with a nice overall feel that doesn't feel like it's kind of leaning in one direction. If all of my feathers were all pointing kind of in this direction, the whole piece would feel very tilted. But if we mix in some that go the other way, it becomes much more balanced. I'm going to meander my way around this little area, filling it in with swirls and feather petals, trying to get them to nest as closely as possible to each other so that I don't end up with weird spots, and it just makes my life easier when I can plan where I want to go without creating holes for myself. I do run into a little bit of trouble here in a moment, and I will show you what I did to correct that. So I've been working on filling our area with swirl feathers, and I wanted to bring attention to this area that I was quilting. I came along and started to do this swirl, and I feathered here. And when I got to right here, I realized that I was going to have this dead area between all these feathers right here. So I popped out, I did a little swirl, I added a couple little feathers, and then I bounced back around them. And then I just kept working around the same swirl. I added a couple more feathers until I kind of finished it, and then I bounced out and went on. Now these two are not the ideal arrangement, but when you stand back and you look at it, it all melts together. It's totally fine. And I'm working with white thread on this dark maroon fabric so that you guys can see it, but I used yellow thread on this yellow fabric for my bobbin thread, and now it's just this wonderful texture. And that little weird area blends in even more. So if you are working with blending thread on a quilt top, then Don't worry about the little imperfections or if there's like a little wobble or if your design doesn't go exactly as you plan, because once it's done, it will all totally blend together and look fantastic. Now that we've learned the basics of the swirl feather, let's talk about a few variations. The first is playing with the relative size of the designs. We stitched and drew all of our designs relatively the same size, with the same size center and the same size feather. But if you mix small and large designs, you get a whole different look, and drawing it and stitching it is exactly the same. You draw your traditional swirl feather. And then when it is time to make your next, you draw a little tiny baby one. You can add little tiny ones every other design, or you can have mostly small ones and large ones, whatever arrangement you think looks best. And an entire field of those might look something like this. I think this looks a little bit more like a flower field with lots of different styles of flowers coming together, little buds and great big ones. I think this is a really fun look, and it does add a little bit of variety while you're stitching. The next variation is one on the feather petals themselves. If you looked closely, you may have noticed I was struggling to draw some of those feathers. That's because I usually draw and stitch my feathers with the hump and bump method of construction. And here's what I mean by that. We're going to draw our traditional circle swirl start. The first petal I'm going to make in the same way we have been, just to establish something to work off of. Then I am going to make my feathers by connecting at this point, and then as soon as I touch there, I'm going to trace back along that stitched line and then make another feather petal. And I'm going to continue that pairing, and I'm going to separate my lines a little bit so you can see where I'd be tracing back around our center. This is more of a traditional looking feather, and I really like how the petals look like they are fanning out and behind one another. It's also faster for me to stitch, so this is what I usually default to. A whole field of those would look something like this. It's a little bit more classic looking. It uses all of the same construction methods and moving around methods that we learned with the basic swirl feather. It just has that different feather construction. One final variation I want to show you is one that might appeal to you if you want a looser style of quilting. And it is the same feather swirl, but instead of bringing all of our points together to touch, we're going to keep a little bit of space between them all. So when we draw our swirl, we're going to leave a lot of space inside. I'm going to barely close it off and bring it around, and I do not want these points to touch because I want to leave space between all of my quilting lines. Then I'm going to begin my feathers. But I'm going to stop short of bringing this back to that swirl spine that we established. Then I'm going to continue making my petals all the way around, leaving that space. It's a much looser design. It would also be a lot faster to stitch since you're just getting more area done with every swirl that you stitch out. It's going to result in a little bit of a comfier, squishier quilt. So if you're looking for something fast and easy, then this would be great for you. A whole field of them would look something like this. It retains a lot of the feel that we have from the original swirl feather, but there's just a lot more space between each of the elements, and it's going to result in a squishier, puffier, comfier quilt. So if you're looking for something like a family quilt or a gift quilt, something that you want to get done quickly and have it be super comfy, then this is a great option to still get that look. So that's our swirl feather. This is a really great design to dip your toes into feathers. It keeps them relatively compact, and it's great to do on a domestic sewing machine for that reason. Traditionally, feathers can get pretty long and pretty elaborate, but this is a way to keep them relatively compact and easy to sew with just that space that you have clear under your regular sewing machine needle. You can get a whole swirl feather done, bounce around, and do a whole other one without a lot of fuss and rearranging of your entire quilt. If you guys want to see more free motion quilting designs on a domestic machine, then definitely let me know in the comments. And I will leave the link to the playlist for all of my free motion quilting designs on the screen somewhere here at the end. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day and happy quilting!